The doctors couldn't save the millionaire's daughter who fallen sick in the restaurant. Minutes later, the waiter said he could help, and everyone was paralyzed when they saw what she did. Before starting the video, tell me where you are watching this video and what time it is. The restaurant was a shimmering palace of indulgence. Chandeliers cascaded with crystalline light, casting a soft golden glow across the velvet-draped booths and marble-topped tables. Guests sipped aged wines, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a live string quartet. In the heart of this opulence sat Jonathan Langston, a self-made millionaire whose commanding presence exuded authority and wealth. Beside him was his daughter, Sophie, a radiant young woman of 16 whose wide smile belied a hint of unease. Jonathan's relationship with Sophie was, at best, a tightrope walk. He loved her fiercely but struggled to balance his demanding business empire with fatherhood. Tonight was an attempt at reconciliation, an elaborate dinner meant to bridge the growing distance between them. Sophie, dressed in an elegant sky-blue gown, was his pride and joy, though he rarely said so aloud. Their conversation was light, punctuated by the occasional distraction of Jonathan glancing at his phone. Sophie teased him about his inability to unplug, her laughter bright but tinged with quiet resignation. Around them, the restaurant hummed with life, waiters in crisp uniforms gliding between tables, delivering culinary masterpieces under silver domes. Unbeknownst to everyone, a quiet storm was brewing. Sophie, though outwardly cheerful, rubbed her temple briefly, the gesture going unnoticed. Her father reached for his wine glass, his focus elsewhere as the evening unfolded, oblivious to the subtle signals of unease from the one person he cherished most. Amid the bustle, one person noticed, a young waitress stationed nearby, her keen eyes catching Sophie's faint frown and her shifting posture. But for now, the signs were too faint to warrant concern. As the evening unfolded, Sophie's laughter began to falter. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the table. Her eyes darted around the room, as though searching for an anchor amidst the dizziness creeping over her. She sipped from her water glass, hoping it would quell the sudden wave of discomfort. "Sophie, are you all right?" Jonathan asked, noticing her hesitation for the first time. "I'm fine, Dad," she replied with a small smile, brushing off his concern. "It's probably just the room, it's warm in here." But her smile didn't reach her eyes. The color in her cheeks seemed to drain subtly, a stark contrast to her bright dress. She pushed her plate away, barely touched, and rested her hand on her forehead as though to steady herself. Jonathan leaned forward, concern flickering in his eyes now. "You haven't eaten much," he noted. "Maybe we should call it a night." "No, really, I'm fine," Sophie insisted, her voice softer this time. She straightened in her chair, feigning composure, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Meanwhile, across the room, the young waitress who had been observing earlier frowned. Her name was Elena, a diligent employee known for her sharp memory and even sharper instincts. She noticed how Sophie seemed to withdraw, her motions sluggish and deliberate. She also noted Jonathan's furrowed brow, the subtle clenching of his jaw. As Elena continued her rounds, her attention lingered on Sophie. There was something off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the heat or exhaustion. She discreetly moved closer, her concern deepening with every passing moment. Jonathan, oblivious to Elena's watchful gaze, signaled for the check. The night that was meant to mend their bond was quietly slipping into unease. Elena positioned herself near the Langston table, her hands deftly arranging cutlery on a nearby counter while keeping an eye on Sophie. She wasn't one to meddle, but years of working in fine dining had taught her to read people. Something about Sophie's pallor and the way she subtly pressed a hand to her abdomen struck a chord of unease in her. Jonathan, still trying to brush off his growing concern, spoke lightly to Sophie. "Maybe we'll skip dessert. We can head home and—" He stopped mid-sentence as Sophie winced, her hand flying to her head. "Are you sure you're okay, sweetheart?" Jonathan asked, his voice tinged with urgency now. He reached out, but Sophie waved him off, her motions sluggish. I just need a minute, she murmured, closing her eyes briefly. Elena, watching from her post, instinctively stepped forward before stopping herself. What could she do? She was just a server. But still, her gut told her this was more than a passing moment of discomfort. The restaurant buzzed on, oblivious to the mounting tension at the Langston table. Elena's colleagues, busy attending to other guests, didn't notice her hesitance. But she couldn't take her eyes off the girl who was clearly struggling. Suddenly, Sophie's fork clattered onto her plate, the metallic sound cutting through the air. She seemed to flinch at the noise, and Jonathan leaned in further, panic beginning to creep into his otherwise composed demeanor. Elena, one of the senior waiters whispered sharply, beckoning her to another table. Elena glanced away reluctantly, her duty pulling her elsewhere for the moment. But as she walked away, she cast one last look over her shoulder at Sophie, the unsettling feeling in her chest refusing to subside. Somewhere in her heart she knew. This night was far from ordinary. It happened in an instant. Sophie's hand slipped from the table, and her body slumped forward. Her father's panicked voice echoed through the luxurious restaurant. Sophie! Sophie! Jonathan's voice cracked, his chair scraping harshly against the marble floor as he stood, reaching for her. The room froze, a bubble of tension bursting in the previously serene atmosphere. Guests turned to look, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Sophie's small frame looked frail in her father's arms as he tried to shake her awake, her head lolling to one side. "Someone call 911. Jonathan shouted, his composed facade shattered. A waiter darted toward the hostess stand, frantically dialing. Within moments, 2 diners who were doctors rushed forward, their professionalism cloaking their worry. "What happened?" one of them asked, crouching beside Sophie and checking her pulse. "She said she felt dizzy earlier," Jonathan choked out. "She didn't eat much." "I don't know." The doctors worked swiftly, one adjusting Sophie's airway while the other checked her vitals. The hushed whispers of the onlookers grew louder, a ripple of concern spreading across the room. Still, Sophie's body remained motionless, her breathing shallow. Jonathan paced in frantic circles. What's wrong with her? Why isn't she waking up? The doctors exchanged uncertain glances. Her pulse is weak, but it's there. It's possible she's reacting to something she ate, or something else entirely. Nearby, Elena stood frozen, a tray still in her hands. Her heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold. A memory stirred in the back of her mind, a lesson from her past, a piece of knowledge she didn't think she'd ever need. She swallowed hard, debating with herself. Could she help? Should she? Her grip tightened on the tray as she watched, tension growing with each passing second. Jonathan's panic reached a fever pitch as Sophie's breathing grew more labored. The doctors at her side worked swiftly but exchanged grim looks, their whispered conversation adding to the tension. The crowd, once murmuring quietly, now buzzed with escalating concern. "She's not responding to stimuli," one of the doctors said, shaking his head. "It could be an allergic reaction, but we need epinephrine or more advanced care." "Where's the ambulance?" "They're en route," another waiter called out, his voice trembling as he held the phone tightly. Jonathan dropped to his knees beside his daughter, clutching her hand tightly. "Please, somebody help her." His voice broke, raw and desperate. He glanced around the room, his eyes wide with fear. "Isn't there anyone who can do something?" The restaurant fell into a deafening silence, the diners too shocked to move or speak. Then a voice cut through the stillness. "I think I can help." All eyes turned to Elena, who had taken a tentative step forward. She looked small and uncertain under the weight of so many stares, but there was an undeniable resolve in her expression. She placed her tray down on the nearest table, her movements deliberate and steady. "What are you talking about?" one of the doctors demanded, his tone skeptical. "Are you a medical professional?" "No," Elena admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "But I've studied enough to recognize what's happening. I might know what to do." Jonathan's eyes locked onto hers, a mix of hope and disbelief flickering across his face. "You think you can save her?" he asked hoarsely. Elena hesitated, the enormity of her claim weighing on her. "I can try," she said finally. "But you have to trust me." The room held its collective breath. The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Jonathan stared at Elena, torn between desperation and skepticism. "You're a waitress," he said, his voice shaking. "How could you possibly?" "I know it sounds absurd," Elena interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "But I'm not just a waitress. I've been studying pre-med. I've taken courses in first aid and toxicology. I think I recognize her symptoms." "She needs a hospital," one of the doctors snapped, frustration bleeding through their professional tone. "We can't risk an unqualified intervention." Jonathan looked at Sophie, her face pale and lifeless. His mind raced, his daughter's condition deteriorating before his eyes. The doctors were trying, but their uncertainty was palpable. He turned back to Elena, searching her face for something. Conviction, hope, anything to justify trusting a stranger. "What do you think is happening?" he asked her, his voice almost a whisper. "I think she's having an anaphylactic reaction," Elena replied, steadying her shaking hands. "It's rare, but sometimes it can come on suddenly, even if she's never had allergies before. If I'm right, she needs an adrenaline injection now. And if you're wrong," the second doctor pressed, arms crossed. Elena faltered, her resolve flickering. "If I'm wrong, we lose a few minutes until the paramedics arrive. But if I'm right," she glanced at Sophie, lying limp on the floor. "She doesn't have minutes." The weight of her words settled over the room. Jonathan clenched his fists, then knelt back beside Sophie, stroking her hair. "Do it," he said hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "Whatever you think will help, do it." Elena's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't hesitate. She turned toward the kitchen, calling for a first aid kit. The crowd parted as she moved, her steps quick and deliberate. The room held its collective breath as she began. The first aid kit was thrust into Elena's hands by a trembling sous chef. Her fingers flew as she tore it open, scanning its contents for the one thing she hoped would be there: a preloaded epinephrine injector. Relief washed over her as she found it nestled among the bandages and antiseptic wipes. Elena returned to Sophie's side, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Jonathan hovered beside his daughter, his face pale and drawn. The two doctors exchanged glances but refrained from intervening. They seemed torn between opposing their unqualified colleague and acknowledging that, with time running out, Elena might be Sophie's best hope. "Okay," Elena murmured, mostly to herself, as she knelt by Sophie. Her hands trembled as she uncapped the injector, but her voice grew firmer. "This is going to help her breathe." She positioned the injector against Sophie's thigh, her motions confident despite the pressure of so many eyes on her. She took a deep breath and pressed the plunger. A soft click sounded, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd. The medication delivered, Elena withdrew the injector and massaged Sophie's leg lightly, her heart pounding in time with the silent prayers racing through her mind. The room remained silent except for Jonathan's soft, "Is it working?" His voice cracked, every ounce of hope hinging on Elena's actions. "Give it a moment," Elena replied, her own breath uneven as she watched Sophie's chest rise and fall. First, nothing changed. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers of doubt rippling through the air. Elena felt their judgment like daggers, but she stayed focused, willing Sophie to respond. Then a miracle. Sophie's breathing, shallow and strained moments before, began to deepen. A faint flush of color returned to her cheeks. "She's stabilizing," one of the doctors said in awe. Jonathan's breath hitched as he watched the subtle transformation unfold. Sophie's chest began to rise and fall with more rhythm, her previously ashen complexion softening to a pale pink. The faintest groan escaped her lips as her eyelids fluttered. It was small, barely noticeable, but it sent a ripple of hope through the room. "She's coming back," Elena whispered, relief flooding her voice. She leaned back on her heels, clutching the empty injector as though it were a lifeline. Her trembling hands betrayed the calm she had maintained throughout the ordeal. The doctors moved closer to Sophie, their earlier skepticism replaced by cautious optimism. One gently took her wrist to monitor her pulse while the other assessed her vitals. "Her breathing is improving. Whatever you did, it's working." Jonathan let out a strangled sob and clutched Sophie's hand, his shoulders shaking. "Sophie, can you hear me?" His voice was thick with emotion, his usual composed demeanor completely unraveled. Sophie's eyes opened a sliver, unfocused but moving. "Dad," she murmured weakly, her voice barely audible. The sound was enough to bring Jonathan to his knees. He pressed her hand to his lips, tears streaming freely down his face. Around them, the crowd erupted in scattered applause and murmurs of admiration. Elena, still seated on the floor, blinked in surprise at the attention. A small smile tugged at her lips, but she quickly turned her focus back to Sophie. Despite the relief flooding the room, a note of skepticism lingered in the air. One of the doctors cleared his throat. "This doesn't explain what caused the reaction," he said. "We need to consider whether something here triggered it. A food allergen, perhaps?" Elena's expression grew serious. She glanced toward the kitchen. "I have a feeling it's not an accident." The initial relief was quickly replaced by an unsettling sense of suspicion. Sophie's sudden collapse and her alarming reaction didn't sit well with Elena. She had seen cases of severe allergies during her studies, but this felt different. Her gut told her there was more to the story. "What are you saying?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. He remained by Sophie's side, stroking her hair as if the contact alone could shield her from further harm. Elena hesitated, her mind racing. "I don't think this was random," she said carefully. "Anaphylaxis can happen spontaneously, but usually there's a clear trigger. If Sophie doesn't have a history of allergies, we need to figure out what caused this." "She barely touched her food," Jonathan pointed out, glancing at the plate. The untouched pasta and glistening vegetables seemed innocuous enough, but his unease deepened. One of the doctors nodded. "She's stable now, but she'll need tests to confirm what caused the reaction. If it's an allergen in the food, it would be unusual for symptoms to appear so quickly unless there was a high concentration." Elena stood, her gaze drifting toward the kitchen. "I know it's not my place, but I work here. I know how things operate. If something in the food caused this, we need to act fast before someone else gets hurt." Her words caught the attention of the restaurant manager, who approached nervously. "This is a high-profile establishment," he said, his tone defensive. "Our standards are impeccable. There's no way." "Then you won't mind if we check," Elena interrupted, her voice firm. "If it was an accident, fine. But if it wasn't..." Jonathan looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You think this might have been deliberate?" Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she strode toward the kitchen, her determination unwavering. Elena pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, her presence surprising the bustling staff. The chefs, sous chefs, and dishwashers paused, their eyes darting from her to the manager, who followed close behind, sputtering protests. "You can't just walk in here," the manager barked, but Elena ignored him. Her focus was laser-sharp. "We need to check everything Sophie's plate came into contact with," she declared, scanning the room for the prep stations. Her voice carried an authority that silenced even the head chef. "This is preposterous," the manager continued. "We run a pristine operation." "Then prove it," Jonathan cut in, his imposing figure suddenly filling the doorway. His presence silenced the room entirely. "If my daughter's condition was caused by negligence, I'll know. And if it wasn't, then we have a much bigger problem." The kitchen staff exchanged uneasy glances. Elena stepped forward and inspected the station where Sophie's dish had been prepared. She traced the ingredients back, asking pointed questions about the source of each item. A pattern began to emerge. Sophie's meal had been handled by one chef more than anyone else. "Elena, what are you looking for?" Jonathan asked, following her movements, She held up a small vial she'd found tucked behind the spice rack. "This doesn't belong here," she said, turning it over in her hand. The label was faint but unmistakable. Peanut oil concentrate. Jonathan frowned. Peanuts. Sophie's never had a problem with them before. Elena nodded grimly. This isn't something that would just slip into a dish by accident. The amount needed to cause a reaction like hers would have been deliberate. The head chef stepped forward, his face pale. "We don't use that here," he said firmly. "That shouldn't even be in this kitchen." The room went cold as realization began to dawn. Someone had tampered with the food. The weight of Elena's discovery settled over the kitchen like a heavy fog. Jonathan stared at the vial in her hand, his mind racing. "Who could have done this?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with fury. "And why?" The head chef shook his head, visibly shaken. "Have no idea. We have strict protocols. Every ingredient is logged, every station monitored. This is sabotage." Elena's gaze swept the room, her instincts honing in on the staff. Most of them looked shocked, but one figure stood apart, a sous chef lingering near the back, his expression unreadable. Elena's eyes narrowed. "Who prepared Sophie's plate?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The head chef hesitated, then turned toward the sous chef. "Liam," he said, "you plated the dish. Did you see anything unusual?" Liam stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. "No," he said too quickly. I don't know how that got there." "Really?" Elena pressed, stepping closer. "Because this vial was tucked behind your prep station." All eyes turned to Liam, who began to shift uncomfortably. "That's not mine," he snapped. "I don't even know where it came from." Jonathan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Why would someone do this? If you know something, speak now." Liam's composure cracked. He glanced toward the exit, sweat beading on his forehead. I didn't mean for it to go that far," he stammered. "It was supposed to just scare you." Jonathan's eyes darkened. "Scare me," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "I needed you to notice me." Liam blurted out, his words tumbling over each other. "You don't care about the people you step on to get your millions. My brother lost everything because of you. His job, his health, and you didn't even blink." The room froze as Liam's confession hung in the air. Jonathan took a step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over Liam. "You're telling me you put my daughter's life in danger because of some grudge against me?" His voice was low, each word laced with fury. Liam backed up, his hands raised defensively. "I wasn't trying to hurt her," he protested, his voice shaking. "I just wanted you to feel what it's like to lose something precious like my family did because of your corporate deals. I didn't think it would go this far." "That's a lie," Elena interjected sharply. She held up the vial. "This isn't something you just grabbed to scare someone. You knew exactly what you were doing when you added this to her dish." The head chef stepped forward, his face a mask of betrayal. "Liam, how could you? You've worked with us for years. This isn't just about Mr. Langston. This is about everyone here. You've jeopardized the reputation of this restaurant and the safety of our guests." Liam's eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating an escape. But Jonathan's next words stopped him cold. "You'll pay for this," Jonathan growled, his fists clenched. "Not just legally but morally. My daughter almost died tonight because of your actions. Whatever you think I did to your brother, this isn't justice, it's cowardice." The authorities arrived moments later, summoned by the manager. Liam was taken into custody, his protests drowned out by the murmurs of the kitchen staff. The vial of peanut oil was logged as evidence, sealing his fate. As Liam was led away, Jonathan turned to Elena. His voice was softer now, filled with gratitude. "You saved Sophie's life tonight," he said. "If it weren't for you." Elena shook her head, her expression unreadable. "I just did what anyone should do." The restaurant staff and guests gathered in the dining room, the atmosphere still thick with the evening's events. Sophie, now resting on a makeshift cot brought in by the paramedics, appeared more stable. Her cheeks had regained some color, and her breathing was steady, though she remained under close observation. Jonathan sat beside her, holding her hand as if afraid to let go. His earlier anger had faded into exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. He glanced across the room at Elena, who stood quietly by the bar, her expression pensive. "Elena," Jonathan called out, beckoning her. The entire room fell silent as she approached, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Yes, Mr. Langston," she asked softly. Jonathan rose to his feet, his towering figure intimidating yet humbled. "You didn't have to step in tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You could have left it to the doctors or waited for the paramedics. But you didn't. You acted when my daughter needed help most, and you saved her life." A smattering of applause broke out among the guests, growing louder as the weight of Jonathan's words sunk in. Elena flushed, ducking her head modestly. "I just did what anyone should," she said, her voice barely audible over the applause. "No," Jonathan said firmly, shaking his head. "You went above and beyond. Most people wouldn't have done what you did." He paused, glancing back at Sophie before turning to Elena again. "You're not just a waitress. You're a hero." The applause swelled, and even the kitchen staff joined in. Elena's eyes glistened, but she maintained her composure, offering a shy smile. She didn't feel like a hero, just someone who had stepped up when it mattered most. The moment marked the beginning of a ripple effect that would change their lives. As the applause subsided, the weight of the night settled over the room. Paramedics prepared Sophie for transport to the hospital, ensuring she would receive further care and tests. Jonathan hovered protectively over her, his demeanor transformed from the composed businessman to an anxious and devoted father. Elena quietly stepped back, blending into the shadows. Her role, she thought, was done. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned abruptly and called her name again. "Elena, wait," he said, his voice carrying across the room. She froze, turning to face him. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice raw. "You didn't just save my daughter tonight. You've made me realize how much I've taken for granted. I've spent so much of my life chasing success that I lost sight of what really matters." Sophie stirred faintly on the cot. "Dad," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. Jonathan bent down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Tears welled in his eyes as he turned back to Elena. "She's all I have," he said, his voice breaking. "And I almost lost her tonight because I wasn't paying attention. But you noticed. You saw what even I didn't see. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Elena shook her head, her voice calm but insistent. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Langston. Just make sure Sophie knows how much she means to you." Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "I will," he said firmly. Sophie opened her eyes more fully now, gazing at Elena with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You're amazing." Elena smiled back, a wave of humility and relief washing over her. In that moment, a bond formed between them, one built on trust, courage, and newfound appreciation. The aftermath of the night began to settle as Sophie was carefully wheeled out to the waiting ambulance. Jonathan stayed by her side, refusing to let go of her hand. Before stepping into the ambulance, he turned one last time to face the restaurant crowd, his gaze locking on Elena. "This isn't over," he said firmly, his voice carrying an undertone of resolve. "You've done more than save a life tonight, Elena. You've reminded me of what's truly important. I intend to make things right, not just for Sophie but for others too." Elena blinked, unsure how to respond. She gave him a small nod, her humility still apparent. The crowd parted to let the ambulance through, leaving the restaurant in a heavy but contemplative silence. The next morning the news broke. Media outlets picked up the story of the hero waitress, who had saved a millionaire's daughter in a high-end restaurant. interviews with stunned diners, snippets of Jonathan's emotional gratitude, and praise for Elena's quick thinking spread like wildfire. The restaurant manager, eager to salvage the reputation of his establishment, leaned into the narrative. "She's always been one of our best," he told reporters. "Smart, diligent, and resourceful." But Elena avoided the cameras and microphones. She wasn't interested in the spotlight. Her focus was on finishing her studies and pursuing her dream of becoming a doctor. "I'm not a hero," she told a close colleague. "I was just lucky to recognize what was happening in time." Meanwhile, Jonathan and Sophie began discussing ways to use their wealth and influence for good. "We've been given a second chance," Sophie said to her father. "Let's not waste it." Jonathan agreed. That night had changed everything. For Elena, for Sophie, and for him. Days after the incident, the Langston family reached out to Elena personally. A sleek black car pulled up outside the modest apartment complex where she lived. When Elena opened the door to the unexpected knock, she found Jonathan and Sophie standing there, holding a bouquet of vibrant lilies. "I hope we're not intruding," Jonathan said, his smile warm but tentative. "We just wanted to thank you properly." Elena blinked in surprise, her hands awkwardly wiping on her apron. "Oh, you didn't have to do that," she said quickly, glancing behind her at the books and notes scattered across her small table, a testament to her long hours of study. Sophie stepped forward, her recovery evident in her steady posture and glowing complexion. "We had to," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "You saved my life. And we wanted to do more than just say thank you." Jonathan handed her an envelope, its weight hinting at something more significant than a thank you card. "This is for you," he said. "It's a scholarship fund to help you finish your medical degree. No strings attached. Just a small way for us to support someone as extraordinary as you." Elena's mouth fell open. She took the envelope hesitantly, her fingers brushing the embossed stationery. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, overwhelmed. "Say you'll accept it," Sophie said with a grin. "You're meant to be a doctor, Elena. The world needs more people like you." Tears welled in Elena's eyes, but she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "This means more than you know." As the Langstons left, a sense of purpose filled the room. Elena wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone with the chance to fulfill her dream and make an even bigger difference. The days that followed brought a profound shift for both the Langstons and Elena. Jonathan, once laser-focused on his business ventures, found himself reassessing his priorities. He started spending more time with Sophie, accompanying her to her follow-up appointments and savoring their conversations over simple meals at home. One evening after dinner, Sophie sat across from her father in the living room. "You've changed, Dad," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I feel like I've got you back." Jonathan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You never lost me, sweetheart," he said softly. "But I think I lost myself for a while. That night, it scared me. I realized how much I've been missing. How much I've been missing with you." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "I'm glad you're here now," she said. "But we can't just leave it at that. We've got the means to do something bigger. Something that matters." Jonathan nodded, the gears in his mind already turning. "You're right. We need to give back not just to Elena but to others like her. People who have the heart to make a difference but not always the means." By the end of the week, the Langstons had established the Langston Foundation for Unsung Heroes, a charitable organization dedicated to recognizing and supporting individuals who went above and beyond in acts of courage, kindness, and community service. Elena, naturally, was the first honoree. At the foundation's launch event, Jonathan introduced her to a standing ovation. "This young woman reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he said to the crowd. "That true success isn't measured by what you build, but by what you give back." Elena, humbled, accepted the recognition with quiet grace. "I just did what needed to be done," she said. "But I hope it inspires others to do the same." The Langston Foundation quickly gained traction, becoming a beacon of hope and inspiration. Stories of everyday heroes flooded in, teachers who transformed struggling students' lives, healthcare workers who went above and beyond, and ordinary people who displayed extraordinary bravery in moments of crisis. Jonathan and Sophie personally reviewed each nomination, often moved to tears by the tales of resilience and compassion. Elena became an integral part of the foundation, though she insisted on working behind the scenes. She helped shape programs that provided scholarships, emergency aid, and recognition for unsung heroes like herself. Though her name was now associated with the foundation, she remained focused on her studies, determined to become a doctor. One day, Sophie visited Elena at her modest apartment. They sat together over coffee, their bond having grown beyond gratitude into genuine friendship. "You know," Sophie said, stirring her cup, "I used to feel like my dad's world was too big for me. I thought I'd get lost in it. But now, it feels like we're building something that actually matters." Elena smiled, her face lighting up. "You are," she said. "You're showing people that small actions can have ripple effects. Look at us, I was just doing my job that night, but now there's this." She gestured to a pamphlet for the foundation on the table. Sophie nodded, a wistful smile on her lips. "I don't think you realize how much you've inspired us." The conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone buzzing. It was an email notifying her of her acceptance into medical school, a full scholarship attached, courtesy of the Langston Foundation. Elena's eyes welled up as Sophie hugged her. "You're going to change lives," Sophie whispered. "Just like you changed mine." Years later, a radiant Elena stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, dressed in a crisp white coat with a stethoscope draped around her neck. Applause filled the air as she was introduced as the keynote speaker at the annual Langston Foundation Gala. Now a practicing doctor, Elena had not only achieved her dream but exceeded it. She had founded her own clinic in an underserved community, providing affordable healthcare to those who needed it most. Elena scanned the audience, spotting Jonathan and Sophie seated in the front row. Jonathan gave her a proud nod, while Sophie beamed, clapping enthusiastically. Elena smiled, taking a deep breath before beginning her speech. "Sometimes it takes a single moment to redefine your purpose," she began. "For me, that moment came in a restaurant where I wasn't a doctor, but just a waitress with a choice, to act or to step back. That choice changed my life and, more importantly, saved another." The crowd erupted in applause. Elena's voice softened as she added, "And none of this would have been possible without the generosity and vision of the Langston family, who turned a night of fear into a lifetime of impact." The audience rose to their feet, honoring the journey she had undertaken. As the applause subsided, Elena stepped off the stage and was immediately embraced by Sophie. The years had only strengthened their bond, transforming their connection from gratitude into deep friendship. "You were amazing," Sophie said, her eyes glistening with pride. "But I wouldn't expect anything less." Jonathan approached with a warm smile, shaking Elena's hand. "You've turned that moment into something extraordinary," he said. "And you've inspired more people than you'll ever know." Elena smiled, a wave of humility washing over her. "I couldn't have done it without you both. The foundation gave me the chance to become the person I always wanted to be." The three of them made their way to a quieter corner of the gala, where a table was set with mementos of the foundation's achievements. Photographs of past honorees lined the walls, each one a story of courage and kindness. Jonathan gestured toward a new addition to the display, a framed photo of Elena in her clinic, treating a young patient. "It's a reminder of what we can achieve when we work together," he said. Sophie added, "And proof that a single act of bravery can create ripples that touch countless lives." Elena nodded, her heart full. As the gala drew to a close, Elena stood with Jonathan and Sophie on the balcony overlooking the glittering city lights. The air was cool, carrying a sense of serenity and promise. Sophie leaned against the railing, her voice soft. "You know, I think about that night all the time," she admitted. "It was terrifying, but it brought us all here, to this moment." Jonathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Changed everything for me. I thought I was building a legacy through wealth, But now I realize the real legacy is in people, in the lives we touch. Elena, standing between them, felt a swell of gratitude. And it's not just about the big moments, she said. It's about the small choices we make every day. Choosing to help, to listen, to care. Sophie smiled. Exactly. Like what you did for me. The three shared a quiet moment of reflection before Jonathan spoke. This is only the beginning. Together we can do so much more. Elena looked at them both, her heart full. I think so too, she said, her voice steady and hopeful. As they rejoined the guests, Elena felt the warmth of their friendship and the promise of a brighter future. They had all come so far, and there was so much more to give.